Good afternoon, and on behalf of IPAA Queensland, welcome to our first Stewards On the Couch forum for 2020 and our first fully virtual event. As you will no doubt recognise, I am coming to you separately from our speakers today, in keeping with social distancing principles. While we may be virtual, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which this forum is being recorded, the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. But as is my custom, I also acknowledge the wonderful diversity at this forum today, and I pay my respects to all cultures. And as IPAA Queensland President, I would like to extend a warm welcome to individual members. We're very grateful for your continued support. Our Stewards on the Couch series features informal interviews with key leaders across the public purpose sectors. These provide you with the opportunity to learn more about the person behind the role, their motivations, leadership, priorities, and vision for the future. The focus of today's discussion, human rights, is a great fit with IPAA's theme this year, reframing relationships, partnerships, community, and empowerment in public purpose work. Collaborative, constructive, and respectful relationships between levels of government, sectors, clients, and citizens. These are critical to realising the kind of impactful change we're seeking to make for our clients and communities. I would like to acknowledge our sponsor for today's forum, our partner, Holding Redlich. At Holding Redlich, great law is their starting point. Across their offices in Brisbane, Cairns, Melbourne and Sydney, they provide a complete range of legal services for all levels of government, solutions tailored to the government's needs, underpinned by the very best legal thinking and expert industry knowledge. For further information regarding their services, please visit their website, holdingredlich.com. So now let me introduce to you our featured guest and friend, Scott McDougall. Scott is Queensland Human Rights Commissioner with responsibility for the Human Rights Act 2019 and the Anti-Discrimination Act 1991. He has extensive experience in areas of discrimination and human rights law and quite a distinguished career. For almost 2 decades, Scott has advocated on behalf of communities and conducted litigation in the areas of discrimination, native title, criminal law, guardianship, and coronial inquiries. It is also my pleasure to welcome back award-winning journalist, author, and media commentator, and friend of IPAA Queensland, Madonna King, who is facilitating our online conversation with Scott today. Finally, I'd also like to acknowledge another IPAA partner, QUTX, who is providing the live streaming for today's Stewards on the Couch. Madonna, it's now over to you. Please enjoy the forum.
Thanks, Ian, and lovely to see you again. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Madonna.
It's been a windy road to the office of the Queensland Human Rights Commissioner, and I want to understand that path because advocacy is part of who you are. At the age of, as a toddler, your family packed up and left Australia for Hong Kong. Why was that?
Yeah, well, my father was a dairy farmer. Excuse me, my father was a dairy farmer. And the first wave of regulation sort of really wiped out his business and his farm. So he threw his hat in the ring and decided just to go to Hong Kong and chasing a dream of becoming an inventor, which is something he ultimately did do. He invented a toothbrush, an electric toothbrush, and sold it to Colgate. And the rest of the story would take a long time, Madonna, that we don't have time for today, but perhaps
so
another time.
So you grew up in Hong Kong?
My first 3 years, and then we returned back to Beaudesert, and my formative years were in Beaudesert from 5 to about the age of 9. And then my mother moved to the Gold Coast, and I was raised on the Gold Coast, and then off to Brisbane for after high school.
Do you have that entrepreneurial streak of your dad's?
Look, I did a Harvard course in 2018, and I discovered that I do have an entrepreneurial entrepreneurial streak, but not for money making, for not for profit.
Purpose.
Exactly.
And that's why we're here today, I guess.
Exactly.
Just take me back though to that childhood and perhaps as a teenager. What would the student counsellor have thought you would become, or what were you telling the guidance officer you wanted to be?
Look, I think I would have, in my teenage years, I would have wanted to be a correspondent following the Australian Test cricket team around the world. And I used to keep a scrapbook where I'd write, stories if I couldn't get a copy of the Australian that
Along
day.
with 1,000 others.
Yeah. My teachers, I think my English teacher was really disappointed that I ended up doing law instead of writing. But they say everyone's got a book inside them, so maybe one day I'll get there.
Is there?
I think so. Friends of mine will have told me a lot of times that there's enough stories in my family to get a book. So I think at some stage I will get to that point.
I look forward to that. So what is the earliest memory you have of wanting to advocate for someone?
Yeah, look, when I was at Bow Desert, one of my best friends in grade 1 was an Aboriginal boy. And I have this distinct memory of being separated from him in the classroom. And it was almost like, I'm sorry, you're the smart kid, I'm sorry you can't sit next to your friend. And I remember being really puzzled and angered by that at the time without obviously being able to comprehend what that was. And I think years later, during my teenage years, I think a lot of people, when they read To Kill a Mockingbird, they're moved by that account of racism. My teenage years were at a time when apartheid was sort of raging in South Africa, and I remember becoming conscious of that. But really my political awakening really didn't happen until I was about 18, 19, and I was fortunate to meet a few people who introduced me to, some, political texts and...
Like what? Yeah, explain that.
Well, Manning Clark, for example. And then I was very fortunate to be able to take up a position at the Ingenuity Community Council, which is an Aboriginal community right on the tip of Cape York, working as a law clerk. And so I lived on a boat on the mouth of the river at Cow Creek.
What did you learn doing that?
That there was another world that existed in Australia with Aboriginal people who had a completely different value system to the rest of Australians. So it was very transformative for me.
And that we don't understand a lot of...
Oh, absolutely, and we've got no appreciation at all. I remember having, in my first couple of days, having a conversation with a small boy, probably 8 or 9 years old, and asked him, how many people were in his family. And he looked at me with this incredibly puzzled expression, like he just couldn't comprehend the question. It was just a stupid question to ask. And he said, too many. And, it took me a few months to realise the stupidity of the question. So the incredibly intricate kinship system that operates in Aboriginal communities, which is very complex, it's one of the first things you sort of have to get your head around.
And that taught you about perhaps discrimination and some of the human rights issues that are now front and foremost. If you went back to that community today, would you fear that a lot of those issues remain not dealt with?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I took a break and actually took 2 boys with me, 14-year-old boys, to Cairns and to Brisbane, it was the first time they'd ever been outside of the community, and we were trying to get a hotel in Cairns, and I had to go to I think 4 places and actually ask the boys to wait outside before we could actually book a room, despite the fact that they had vacancy signs out the front. So that was a taste of the racism, for me as well as them. I'd like to think that's changed. This is 1990.
Yeah. But that period, both as an article clerk and going back, was obviously very important to you and where your trajectory then led professionally. You were director and principal solicitor at the Caxton Legal Centre before this appointment for quite a long time. Well, what would have been your big win there, or a couple of them?
Yeah, I had a few court victories, but a non-court victory that I was quite happy with was getting an exemption for Sikh people to be able to enter the courts without having to remove their ceremonial knife, which is an important part of their religion, the Kapan. So being able to, leverage off the relationship that we had with the Supreme Court to be able to negotiate that without having to go through any formal process or litigation. I think that was a good outcome. I had probably, in terms of my most satisfying outcome, it was probably on behalf of an Aboriginal woman who worked at the store at Kawanyama for 11 years without being paid the same rate as white people. She was a very humble woman who just very quietly gave her instructions, and we were able to get a really good outcome for her that I was happy with.
How many years ago was that?
When she did it was from between 1975, when the Racial Discrimination Act came in, and 1986, so that 11-year period. She didn't recover the compensation until I think it was 2003 or 4.
This century. Does that frustrate you? Do you go home and sit and think, why is this happening in part of our community and not another part?
Yeah, look, it does. I mean, last year I had an experience where I had to visit the Cleveland Youth Detention Centre in Townsville, and that centre has on average, about 95 boys in there, and some girls, but mostly boys. And there was a wall where they have Polaroid pictures of each of the children in each of the units.
Yes.
And they'll have their name, their age, and where they're from. And I was standing there looking at this wall and just confronted by about 93 Aboriginal faces, and I think 2 or 3 non-Indigenous faces. And seeing the age of the children from the remote regions like Mount Isa, being 12, 13, 14, and seeing their faces, and I'm obviously not medically qualified, but to me some of them look like they had FASD, fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's really distressing, and I think that is something that all Queenslanders should be distressed about.
So what leads from distress though? What do you think in your position and given your experience can be done to create an equality there?
Well, on that particular issue with the Indigenous community, I do think we still have to have a reckoning of our past, and there's very little appreciation in Queensland about the history of Queensland and how it is that we've gotten to this position. The relationship between Aboriginal communities and Queensland Police, whilst there's been a lot of improvement in that area in recent times, I know Ian Stewart, who introduced us, has done a lot of work in building that relationship. There's still a long way to go.
What do you see as the human rights issues in relation to the Indigenous community here in Queensland?
Well, I think ultimately that the right to self-determination is acknowledged in the preamble of the Act, but is not entrenched as a enforceable right. I'd like to think with the review of the Act in 4 years' time, that might be something that is reconsidered. And I think that there needs to be a conversation between the government and Indigenous communities in Queensland about what a right to self-determination would actually look like. Because really what needs to happen is some power sharing.
And in your new role as Human Rights Commissioner, can you play a card there?
Yeah, we'd like to think that we have a role in facilitating those discussions. I talked to the Director General of Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, Chris Sarra,
yes,
regularly, and I do think the Commission is in a position to support those discussions.
Okay, we might come back to that in just a moment, but on our way to the Commission, the other thing you worked on was elder abuse laws across Australia. Just explain your role there.
Yeah, so Caxton Legal Centre was a really dynamic organisation, and whilst I was there, and I certainly would not take credit for all of the work of Caxton for the period that I was there, because some great people there who I had the pleasure of working with. One of them was a social worker who came to me back in the early 2000s. I remember it was just a few days before Christmas, and she said, look, they've just changed the domestic violence laws in Queensland to include family relationships. I've got this idea of pitching to them for a program where we pair up a social worker and a lawyer to go and visit vulnerable older people in their homes and see whether they're, prone to financial abuse, primarily from their family members. And that was a pretty novel concept at that time. And so I remember thinking, yep, let's go for this, and just spent the next 24 hours working around the clock to get the submission in. The government backed it, so we started a pilot program, and it proved to be really successful. So it was really important. People who are elderly and being abused by their family members, there's a great deal of shame, sitting as a barrier to actually doing something about that.
Absolutely.
And so it requires a lot of trust between the advocate and the older person to actually take the steps. So that model of having a lawyer and a social worker working together, the lawyer identifying the legal issues, the social worker being aware and building the relationship, was really effective. We've rolled it out across Queensland, and I think some places throughout Australia now taking it on.
So some big wins over quite a long period of time. What made you then say, well, look, I want to put my hat in the ring for Human Rights Commissioner of Queensland, which is also the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner?
Yeah. Well, at the time I applied, it was the Anti-Discrimination Commission,
Yep.
and the Human Rights Act was still a dream, really.
Yeah.
What made me apply? Look, after 16 years at Caxton, it's a long time. I remember saying to the Attorney General actually in my interview that I've been banging my head against the brick wall of government for years. It'd be nice to be on the inside. And without giving too much away, she said, well, you might still be banging your head against the wall from inside government.
And are you?
Yeah, I think to some extent I am. Certainly have a lot more access, obviously, than I had when I was at Caxton Legal Centre.
But I know I'm going off on a tangent. Why is that though? Because government is set up and laws are passed, like the Human Rights Act, for example, which is new to Queensland, and its ambit we'll come to in just a moment. Why then is it difficult then to force the change?
Look, culture is, it's a hard thing to change, but, it happens. It does happen. It happens through a series of continuous acts. So there's persistence, and you've got to persuade people, obviously, to come along with you. But, and then there's things that can happen like COVID-19.
Yeah.
Where we see massive change happen so quickly.
All right, and we'll come to that because I'm sure it's impacting on your job too. What is your job? How big is it? What's the ambit?
Well, look, I have to say so I started October 2018, and the Act, our roles started on the 1st of July last year, and then the complaints mechanism started on the 1st of January this year. 2019 was a whirlwind year where I don't know how many engagements I had, but it was pretty crazy. It was really full on. I'm very proud of the team at the Commission for being able to pull off what we managed to pull off and getting ready for the Human Rights Act. I guess I'm also proud of the public sector generally for getting their own entities in shape, ready for the Act.
Okay, well, what does that mean? So the Act came into operation on January 1 this year.
Yeah.
What does your job now entail?
So we have two core functions. That is to promote an understanding and acceptance of human rights in Queensland.
Yes.
And the other is to conciliate complaints and to handle complaints. Often those roles can conflict. So we have to be very careful in our promotional work that we maintain the perception and the reality of independence
Give me an example.
and impartial handling of complaints.
Yes, how could that happen, the conflict?
Well, for example, right now there's a big issue with who's actually keeping an eye on prisoners in the COVID crisis, because the official visitors are not visiting the prisons. Yeah. A lot of prisoners are in lockdown, in quarantine. They're not getting their daily exercise, which is a requirement of the Mandela rules. There are quite a few issues for people who are in prison. Yeah. And there is a gap, I think, in Queensland that we'll be talking to the Attorney and perhaps the Premier about, where we do need an office of an independent inspector to look after prisoners. So in advocating for that, we need to be mindful that we're also
the arbiter of complaints.
Well, yeah, not really an arbiter, but we can publish information about unresolved complaints.
All right, so that's one group. What other bodies fall within your domain?
Public
entities?
Yeah, so public entities obviously include all the core public agencies, but they also include local governments, universities, such as the University of Queensland, for example.
So that case of the student that the University of Queensland is trying to ban at the moment, is that something you're looking at?
Yeah, look, that could end up being a complaint made to us, yeah, so I shouldn't talk about it because it could potentially be a complaint.
You mentioned local governments. What makes someone lodge a complaint with Human Rights Commission as opposed to, say, the CCC?
Yeah,
How do you work with those other bodies?
Yeah, so the CCC has much stronger coercive powers than we have. Our powers really are limited to handling the complaint and then publishing information afterwards if the complaint's unresolved, and we think there's ways that the public agency could act more compatibly with human rights.
Some people might say that's a toothless tiger. You don't have the power to overturn the decision, perhaps, or?
Yeah, there has been that criticism, and again, the 4-year review, I think, will squarely look at that. Having said that, I've already seen the power of the Act by people making complaints, because it's important for people to understand that you have to complain to the agency first, and then a period of 45 business days has to elapse before you can bring a complaint to the Commission. So that period is a really good opportunity for the agencies to actually nip it in the bud before it actually comes to us.
But because of the embarrassment of the...
Yeah, well, the potential embarrassment.
Yeah.
We're finding that we're able to actually resolve a number of complaints at the very initial inquiry stages. And I've seen that a number of times, and I think that really speaks to the power of the Act.
All right, so I'd like to come to some of those issues and trends and complaints now. Where do you think we are, in your view, in Queensland in terms of human rights? And what do you see as the biggest challenge or the biggest emerging issues?
Well, there's obviously COVID-19 presents a lot of immediate issues.
Let's put that aside for a moment.
Yeah, in terms of the complaints that have come through, I think we've had about 160 inquiries since the 1st of January. And because of that requirement to lodge the complaint with the agency first, we haven't had a high volume of complaints. I think it's just over 50 complaints received. About 5 of those relate directly to COVID. And the rest are a mix of probably what we would have expected, so issues in child safety, issues with prisoners, issues with police, some with the right to access health services, and that's a right that's only recognised in Queensland, not in the other states.
What does the right to access health services mean? Well,
it means the right to access health services without discrimination. So this is a right that I think we're going to see come up, and I hope that regional Queenslanders come to understand and appreciate this right that is available to them. So in terms of things like breast screening, for example, in regional and remote areas, access to those sort of services. So that's an economic, cultural and social right, and the courts recognise that those rights have to be progressively realised, so it is subject to the resources of the state.
Yes.
But over time, I think we will see some interesting complaints that will seek to extend the reach of health services into regional Queensland.
So as a woman living in Roma, you have a right for a mammogram every 2 years like anyone anywhere else. Does that mean that someone can lodge a complaint with the Commission, and the Commission can then, encourage the government that resources are needed in Roma for that purpose?
Yeah, well, we can bring the parties together and they can explore the options, and they can explore the proportionality of the limit on that right. So if there's a good reason and a justifiable reason why those services simply cannot be provided, then they're going to be acting compatibly with human rights.
This could go on for hours. What about the right? So many people say it takes a long time to get an elderly parent into an aged care home. Is that under the right to health services?
No, so aged care is a federal issue and we don't have jurisdiction over that. Yeah. Having said that, I probably sound like John Hewson explaining the birthday cake for the GST.
We'll see how this goes.
Yeah. Having said that, there are 16 state-run aged care facilities in Queensland.
Yes.
So Eventide, for example, where we do have jurisdiction. So, decisions that are made by public servants in those facilities, yes, you can make a complaint about.
We've got so many public servants listening and watching today, and I want to come to their role in this in just a moment. But you mentioned some specific COVID-related complaints. What's been the impact of the pandemic on human rights in Queensland from where you sit?
Oh, it's been absolutely massive. So, to think that you would bring in a Human Rights Act on the 1st of January and then a few months later to have a global pandemic with the sort of impacts on human rights. So obviously freedom of movement has been a huge impact. And it needs to be said that the right to life imposes positive obligations on governments to protect citizens. And the government, both at a national and state level, have done, I think, a superb job in doing that.
Yes.
And the public have done a superb job in complying with the restrictions. But the impact on human rights is profound, and I think there's a really good opportunity here for the public to understand and appreciate that the intense frustration and that sometimes spills over into anger that they're experiencing about being locked down, perhaps being forced into a hotel where they can't even open the window to get some fresh air. They are impacts on your human rights.
And are you getting complaints about those?
Well, we've had inquiries about the hotel quarantines, and it did cause me to have a conversation with the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Young, where we talked about, okay, look, if you're going to have to lock people in, and she was very adamant about the need to do that, then at the very least you need to source hotel rooms that have access to fresh air, because you and I might be able to last 14 days in a locked room without access to fresh air, but a lot of people can't. I actually personally don't know that I could, frankly.
Yeah, of course.
But if you are prone to mental health issues and panic attacks, then that becomes a huge impost on your human rights.
And did the Chief Health Officer listen to you?
Well, I like to think so. I saw a story last week where a woman was being supervised by officers doing her hourly exercise at a hotel. So I'd like to take credit for that. I will.
What about forms of discrimination during COVID? What have you seen there?
Yeah, so we've seen this, and the Police Commissioner and Minister Hinchliffe came out a few weeks ago quite strongly on this issue. We've seen a few incidents in Queensland. We haven't seen too many complaints come into us about it, but certainly in Victoria, in Melbourne and Sydney, there have been some really nasty racist incidents. It does highlight the ineffectiveness, frankly, of our existing vilification laws. And that's something that we'll be working with. We're in the process of actually writing to community leaders in Queensland.
What do you want done?
Well, I think nationally there's room for improvements on addressing online abuse, but in Queensland you have civil vilification that we look after, and that's I could spend hours talking about the limitations of that, but I won't. But we also have criminal vilification, which is a criminal offence that police look after, but they can only bring a charge with the consent of the Attorney General, which is a big impost.
Yes.
And they can't secure a warrant to secure the evidence unless there's a 3-year sentence. So there are things like that that need to be improved.
So do you think that kind of racism is not happening in Queensland, given the complaints are in New South Wales, Victoria, or you're just not seeing it yet?
Yeah, we're not seeing it. And so we really need better ways of reporting it. And so I'm keen to work with the community to, a Muslim woman is probably the least likely person to make a complaint, particularly in a formal setting. So I'm really keen to work with that community to actually work out what are alternative ways that we can engage with you so that we can get an understanding of how big the problem is.
Yes, so you can get the complaints from where they're needed.
Yeah, we can't fight it if we can't see it.
All right, so you're talking about complaints. Thank you for all your questions today too, from someone at the CCC. As the public sector grapples with the impact of COVID-19, what are your concerns and how do we ensure we continue to protect and promote human rights during this time? We've touched on that, but what advice would you give there?
Well, I really think this is as I said before, a great opportunity to actually think about human rights. So when you look at every human right, really at the core of each right is dignity. So, and that would be my message to public servants generally, is when you're grappling with the Human Rights Act, always think dignity, because if you're making a decision that is going to impact on the dignity of another person, the Act basically requires you, and it's fairly simple, just requires you to look for some alternative ways of achieving your objective.
Yes.
That would have less impact on the dignity of that person. Right. Really, when you boil down to it, that's what it is.
Well, we will come back to that. From someone else, what's the most common complaint you've received?
Well, in discrimination matters, it's impairment in the workplace. So disability in the workplace is the most common complaint that we deal with.
In what way?
Well, people being discriminated against because reasonable adjustments aren't being made for them, or they may have been terminated, or they may have a constructive dismissal because of the conditions they're being forced to work in. All those sorts of issues.
Do you have concerns, given you're saying that's the most common complaint, that this is something that we are not good at?
We could get a lot better at it, and I do think one of the submissions that we've made to the Royal Commission on Abuse and Neglect of People with Disability is the need for a quota system to be introduced. I think that's the only way we're really going to achieve significant cultural change when it comes to improving the lives of people with disability.
And you've got a view on the quota system?
A view on it, on what the number should be? No, I'd have to.
Yeah, but that would be a fair way.
You've got to start somewhere.
From someone at Minter Ellison, and good to have you with us. Are there trends in the complaints you're seeing? Well, obviously disability being one of them. Where are they coming from, and what public entities are most affected?
Yeah, so child safety is an issue. So lots of complaints there from family members who want to have contact with children in care. And I think COVID has had a big impact there because a lot of the carers are in the vulnerable age bracket. Many of them are older, and so are wanting to, not be close to family members. Policing, prisoners, education, health to some extent. They're all areas that we're receiving complaints in.
That 45 days between when someone can complain to the entity and then bring their complaint to you is a long time if it relates to child safety or something, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And there is an exception. So we can receive a complaint prior to the 45 days in exceptional circumstances. And
is the complaint you receive against the government policy or the public servant who might be listening and who is charged with implementing the government's policy?
Yeah, so it could be both. So the Act, the beauty of the Act is it targets both policy making and law making. and also individual decisions by public servants on the ground.
So can a public servant on the ground be in trouble with the Human Rights Commission when they are genuinely just implementing what might not be a good policy?
Look, they're not going to be in trouble. As I said, we don't have coercive powers. They might be named as a respondent and come along to a conciliation.
Are you getting public
meeting.
servants named as respondents?
Yeah, look, sometimes. And whether we actually name the respondent, if it's not appropriate to, we won't. And many times it isn't. So, yeah.
Do public servants need to do something to protect themselves here, or does it come back to simply asking that question about the dignity of the person they're dealing with?
Yeah, look, I think if you look to Section 13 of the Act, which has the proportionality analysis in it, if you follow that, you're going to be fine.
Do you believe that public servants across Queensland have been educated sufficiently on the operation of the Human Rights Act to carry out their duties there?
That's a very good question, Madonna.
I'm waiting for the answer.
Look, in Victoria, I think they had 2.5 years to prepare.
Yeah.
I was quite happy to have a shorter period of time, because I heard some feedback from Victoria that they sort of fell into this complacency about it. I think if you ask public servants, they'd probably be screaming at us right now saying, no, there wasn't enough time. But I think I've been really impressed with the preparedness of agencies to come on board with human rights and their level of preparation.
Well, you say that, you mentioned earlier, the cultural change that has to be brought with this. Are people on your side? Do agencies want to embrace human rights and stick to the letter of the law? Are you picking up?
Yeah, I've been really impressed, as I said, about the willingness to actually see this as a way of improving decision making. So I think a lot of work was done in the agencies around their own internal complaint mechanisms, so that they did pick up these issues.
Yes.
Before they come to us. And I'd like to think that is working. We're seeing there's a lot of victories that we're not even seeing at that front end level.
It is a very wide act. For example, it gives you the right to education, right? So what about this week? Does a student whose parent not want them to go to school this week, do they have a right to have them educated at home, given the public messaging around COVID?
A student who doesn't want to go to school and wants to be educated at...
Yeah, or whose parents don't want them to go to school.
I never thought of that issue from the other way around, where they have the right to actually get their kid into the school. But yeah, look, the right to education is going to be... If this COVID-19 situation had continued, we were particularly worried about children who were not going to be given any access to an education. So there's vulnerable children who don't have Wi-Fi at home, or they have, severely dysfunctional families, where if they brought home a laptop, it's not going to be used for education. So luckily, the restrictions on schools are coming to an end pretty soon, and that issue is not going to become a live issue.
But if it does, if there's a spike, what can the Human Rights Commission do?
Well, we can receive complaints, and we can bring education department officials together with complainants to explore options for resolving them. If there's, as I said before, if there's no resolution, we could make recommendations on how the department could act more compatibly with human rights.
Yes. So more compatible with human rights, that's the right to education. What other rights are enshrined in the law that we may not understand? How big is it?
It is very huge. So the right to privacy is a big one, and that's many of the cases that came out of Victoria were about the right to privacy, and tied up in the right to privacy is the right to autonomy, and also the right to receive information is tied up in the right to freedom of expression. So that's not something you would see freedom of expression and think, oh, well, that's a right to receive information. I guess another example is freedom against torture includes the right not to be subjected to medical treatment without free and informed consent. So there's 23 categories of rights, and they are very broad.
What about if we're talking about climate change, the right to clean air?
Yeah, there's no direct right to clean air, but with climate change, there's a very interesting case from the Netherlands that came out just before Christmas last year called Urgenda versus the Netherlands. And the Supreme Court of the Netherlands ordered that the Dutch government reduce carbon emissions by 25% of 1990 levels by the end of this year. Interestingly, with COVID, they've probably been able to achieve that quite easily now. But they did that on the basis of the positive obligations on the government to protect the right to life,
Right.
which is very interesting, and also on the basis of the right to privacy and not interfering with people's homes.
So could something like that play out in Australia?
Look, potentially, it's a very different setup here in Queensland as opposed to the Netherlands, but it's something that I suspect will come before the courts at some stage.
I was just thinking, you've said a couple of times the right to life. Is there any impact there on the discussion on the euthanasia debate in Queensland?
Yeah, absolutely. So we made a submission on the euthanasia bill. If you apply a human rights analysis, there is no right or wrong answer to the issue. So there's the right to life, there's also the right to autonomy and the freedom to choose to end your life. And so they are competing with each other.
How much extra work does all of this put into the in tray of a public servant? Is it something that over time is just educated and it's part of that job, or at the moment is it a very, everyone has to give it their focused attention?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the obligation in the Act is to give proper consideration to human rights when making a decision, and if you apply that literally to every single decision that's made and expect paperwork around that, then the operations of government are going to grind to a halt pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So there has to be a practical, common sense approach, and that's what the courts have said in Victoria. And that's certainly what I would encourage and promote. Obviously, the more serious the impact that there is going to be on someone's human rights, the better quality consideration that needs to be given to it.
Yeah, sure. Priorities. What change do you think the Commission is capable of enacting in Queensland? What's the vision of Queensland that you can see?
I would really like, first of all, for everyone in Queensland to have a real appreciation of their human rights and value them, and the ability to actually access them and to access remedies when they have been infringed. So people know innately, I think, when their dignity has been interfered with.
Yeah.
And so being able to actually act on that, that would be success for me. In terms of public servants, I would really love it if it just became second habit for them to think, okay, this decision I'm making, is there a human right that's engaged by it? What other ways can we do this?
And also to see that big vision. What do you as Commissioner see as the biggest challenge to a Queensland where human rights were enacted and considered and just operated below the radar?
Look, I guess the biggest challenge is indifference and governments just giving lip service to human rights. I think it's important that governments are held to account. So I guess one example of that, Madonna, is the committee system in Queensland. It's important that those committees actually, when they're conducting their inquiries, really meaningfully engage in human rights and look at the justifications that are put up.
Give me an example.
Well, late last year in the protest laws, the way that they were introduced, there was a very short time to prepare for the committee process, and the way that the committee system operated. We came on before the police, so we became party to the police justification after we'd actually given our evidence to the committee.
So are you able to actively pursue something like that, or do you have to wait for a complaint? Or you do it via submissions and negotiations?
Yeah, so that's a process that's part of the Act that's separated from complaints. So when new legislation is made, there's a requirement that a compatibility statement be tabled, and then the legislation goes to a committee for the human rights to be discussed and considered.
I think you just said something, the rhetoric doesn't really equal the reality sometimes, is I think, similar to what you said. Well, taking on some of these inequities or issues invariably put you on a collision course with the government?
No doubt. And this is the beauty of the Act and the beauty of Section 13, because it provides this principled, structured way of looking at whether a limitation on a human right can actually be justified in a free and democratic society. So I'm quite comfortable being in a collision course with a government where the debate is structured around those principles.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. What specifically do you see as the greatest challenge for human resource practitioners in a post-COVID Australia?
Yeah, well, we're not post-COVID yet, so I think a big issue is workplace health and safety. So obviously there's obligations on employers to protect the safety of staff, but there's also the human rights of people on the end of services that need those services. So there's a real tension there, I think.
You've negotiated Indigenous land use agreements, won several discrimination cases that we've talked about. How do you actually judge that the Commission is doing a good job here in Queensland?
I think whether people and lawyers lodge complaints to the Commission with confidence, knowing that something will actually be achieved by lodging a complaint, I think that is the test. When I was at Caxton Legal Centre, I made the point that as far as I was concerned, unless lawyers at Caxton could instruct or give advice to their clients that they could do something about their human rights, then the Human Rights Act wasn't going to be of much value at all.
Yes.
And luckily the Act does include the complaint mechanism that allows that. It's also an indirect an indirect cause of action to the courts.
Yeah.
But the primary remedy is the complaint mechanism.
A lot of it comes in educating the public on what it does and how it does it too. Are there plans going forward to increase that education across Queensland?
Yeah, well, I was hoping before COVID to really get out and about in Queensland this year, particularly in Indigenous communities. So those plans have been laid to waste, but I'm very happy we have an excellent comms team who are doing great work in getting the message out, but we'll certainly be doing a lot more.
And perhaps they'll be able to use our chat today to educate people
certainly hope
online. IPAA's theme for 2020 is reframing relationships, partnerships, community and empowerment in public purpose work. In navigating change, what's the key skill that you think is important? Is it patience? Is it advocacy? Is it being articulate? Is it negotiating?
I think it's all of those things. I think it's about being able to see where you need to go and then having the ability to convince others that they should come with you to that place. I really think that's what it's about.
And is that the base of how you see your own leadership?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I've never sort of dwelt on, what my particular leadership skills are, but if I had to, I'd say it's about, seeing what is out there, knowing your environment, knowing what the opportunities are, and then being prepared to make the tough calls. Because sometimes, invariably, there will be tough calls and people won't like them.
Yes.
And you've got to be prepared to tough that out to get to where you think you need to go.
I'm putting you on the spot here, but if I was interviewing your staff, what would they say about your leadership?
Oh, look, you'd have to ask them, but you know, I do think I like to think that leadership is not something that is just at the top.
Yeah.
So one of the real joys that I've had throughout my career really is seeing, you know, at Caxton, young lawyers really blossom by giving them the right cases and the right resources and the freedom just to run with things. And I really see that as, you know, probably integral to my approach in any workplace is about clearing a path, identifying talent in the first place. And I do think I have some ability in identifying talent and bringing, you know, the right people together.
So what do you look
to build
for?
a team.
When you're looking for someone for a team, you say identifying talent. So many people listening who want to get ahead. What do you look for in a person?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it depends on the role, of course. So you've really got to match it to the role. But look, I hate to say it, but a can-do attitude I think is really important. So I look for people who are going to find solutions rather than problems.
Yeah.
People who are going to bring solutions to me rather than just the problem.
Yeah.
And I think usually in an interview you can get a sense of that.
What about post-COVID? Leadership will change, how we deliver services will change, how we operate in offices will change. Can you give us any indication as a leader of how you see that will play out?
It's going to be fascinating. You know, we were trying to get a budget approved so that we could actually increase our, you know, do an office revamp. It's funny how so quickly that can just go out the window. So I think people unquestionably are going to see the value of working from home. All of our staff had Surface Pros before COVID. So for us it was a very seamless thing to be able to go and work from home.
And as a boss, as a leader, is it your job to try and then navigate that or be flexible so people are working in the environment they want, in the way they want, in the hours they want?
Yeah, I've always been a fan of flexible work arrangements. Going back to my article clerk days where I had a pretty horrible experience as an article clerk with a boss that used to give me a day and a half for an exam per year, and there were literally no holidays. Like I didn't have a holiday other than public holidays, and 1.5 days per
Where's
subject.
that boss now?
He's passed away now. He's Fred Lippitt. He was an incredible man, but yeah, there's like a talk.
Hard.
Yes.
Hard.
Very, very hard. I learnt that was not, you know, conducive to productive workplace.
Yeah. A question from our audience: when will pay inequity and gendered occupational segregation be addressed by governments as a matter of human rights?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It does need attention both from governments and the private sector. My partner in life is a lawyer who's come through the big firms. She's now in her sole practice, and part of the reason she's in sole practice is because of that gender discrimination. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. And COVID's been quite interesting because I saw a poll in the Courier Mail the other day that said that only 13% of parents who are actually doing the heavy lifting of homeschooling during COVID are males. So I think that's been another impact on women.
Yes.
They're expected to do the work at home.
So
and
can you
the
play a
school.
role here?
Do we? Yeah, so we work closely with the National Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins,
Yes.
on that. And we also are responsible for overseeing sexual harassment in the workplace, so we take complaints about sexual harassment. So yeah, that is an area that we are interested in.
Another question from our audience, and thank you for your questions. Any case law yet applying in the new Queensland Human Rights Act?
Yeah, it's been slow, and it's very important because, you know, the Parliament's invited the Supreme Court to the Human Rights Ball. the big question is, is the Supreme Court going to get up and dance? And
Yeah.
I guess what kind of dance are they going to do? I'd like to think that it'll be contemporary and maybe with a bit of classical ballet in there. But so we have seen one decision from Justice Applegarth, and which didn't go into a great detail. We're waiting for we did appear in that case, but we're waiting for the right case to come along where the Commission will intervene. We're hoping that it'll sort of really tease out some of the key issues, because the court's really got an important role in actually developing a jurisprudence in Queensland that's going to be practical on the ground.
Yes. On court, another question. Can the Commission provide guidance on when an individual's human rights will be impacted by an act or decision made in respect of a corporation? This issue was recently considered by the Supreme Court in the Australian Institute for Progress versus the Electoral Commission. Are you aware of that case?
Yeah, so that's the one I'm talking about with Justice Applegarth.
So the question there, the court found that a decision preventing an incorporated think tank from engaging in election activities limited the human rights of individuals who made gifts to the think tank.
Yeah. And I found it was justified because of the interest of combating corruption in a society that that values democratic freedoms. So there wasn't anything terribly surprising in that case. And I guess if the question is about the rights of corporations versus the rights of individuals, yes, corporations don't have human rights, but human rights can still be relevant in a scenario like that because the interpretive provision in Section 48 requires all courts to consider and interpret laws consistently with human rights.
Can I come back to the personal? Because as we've navigated the past hour or so, there's so many bad things you've seen, and your job is to try and find the silver lining and make it bigger. How do you actually look after yourself? How do you go about, does it ever get too much?
Yeah, look, I think after a really intensive period of work, and I've done this throughout my career, I will always try to just take the foot off the pedal, find a few days where I can just, chill out a bit.
What do you do when you chill out?
Oh, look, I've got 5 children.
I don't call that chilling out.
The youngest one, the youngest will always, probably bring you down to earth the most. So
because you only have a dad in the lounge room, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that helps me go to another place. I think reading at night off paper rather than a blue screen.
Yes.
That's something I've learnt recently. It's far easier to get a good night's sleep if you actually read off paper, preferably not something about work.
Yeah, of course. Are you proud of where we are in Queensland in terms of human rights, or where do you sit on that pride barometer?
Oh, look, I'm really proud that we've been able to get this act in place in Queensland. I really do think it positions Queensland in the future to project itself as a modern world city, where we have this act here. And where government is accountable, and the excesses of government that we've seen in Queensland's past, really the Human Rights Act does operate as a constraint on those. So I am proud, but as you mentioned before, there is a gap between rhetoric and reality. And as you said before, there's no doubt going to be some collision points.
Do you believe it will go some way to mending some of those horrible things you saw as an article clerk in an Indigenous community in far north Queensland and got you on this road in a sense?
I'd like to think so. I mean, I've spent a career sort of advocating, as you said, and sometimes you'll see the cycle. For example, prisons now. I think back to when I first went to a prison in 1989, and just yesterday I was appearing before a committee where they were talking about banning lifers permanently from ever being considered for low security facilities, whereas my earliest experience in prison has really demonstrated to me that the role that life has played in actually calming down the environment in a jail. And they are ideally suited for low security. Well, not all of them, obviously, but many of them are ideally suited for low.
Hard thing to sell in the public, though.
Exactly, and this is, I guess, one thing I would say to public servants is, the courier mail test is something that people talk about, behind the doors and never talk about publicly, obviously. But the courier mail test is not necessarily a public interest test.
Or the human rights test.
And a far better test is Section 13's proportionality analysis. So if you have the courage to actually implement Section 13 as opposed to, indulging in risk aversion, then I think that's something we should all strive for.
Can I say thanks for what you do?
Certainly.
Well, what haven't I asked you that I should have?
I'm not going to say, because then you'll ask me.
Well, Scott McDougall, thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Such an informative and candid discussion about Scott's distinguished career championing human rights from the moment he was a teenager or before. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. On behalf of IPAA Queensland, it's my pleasure to close this forum. We hope you leave better informed on the human rights agenda, the issues, the progress, the challenges ahead, and with some valuable insights and perhaps even inspiration for how you can make a positive difference in progressing human rights for all of us, both in your professional and personal roles. We'd love you to connect with IPAA via events, the website, social media channels, and of course membership. Please watch out for further information about the next event that will be on June the 2nd during National Reconciliation Week, and it will feature the Director General of the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, Chris Sara. On behalf of IPAA Queensland, I would like to acknowledge Holding Redlich for their generous sponsorship of today's forum, and QUTX for providing the virtual delivery. IPAA values these partnerships. And thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon.